Okay. Okay, evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here. And lovely to speak to many of you again in such a short amount of time. But my name's Andy Dibben. I am head grower at Abbey Home Farm, which is a farm in Gloucestershire. It's a 660 hectare mixed farm. We've been organic for 30 years, or over about 34 years now. I've been there for the last 10 years, employed as head grower. I've been an organic grower for 17 years, organic veg. I was in livestock and forestry before that. Um, it's a big farm. Luckily for me, I'm just in charge of 6 hectares of fruit and veg. We grow that on a field scale, intensive market garden, and we've got 1,000 meters squared of plastic and 1,000 meters squared of glass. And while I grow all that, I train a team of apprentices is my main workforce. The wider farm, the whole remit for the wider farm, of those of you who haven't been here, is essentially to feed the local community with as wide a range of organic produce as possible. So we've got a dairy herd, we've got a beef herd, we've got pork, we've got table birds, we've got laying hens, how much is it? 600 acres of arable. We've got a butchery on site, a bakery on site, cheesemaker on site, and everything is targeted at a cafe and a farm shop. And give or take, we reckon we feed about 800 people a week with most of their kind of like farm produced food. We also import whole foods and tropical fruits from around the world, but we really do try and produce as many different crops as possible and animals as possible for 12 months of the year. Particularly to do with this session, we are, as a general rule of thumb, our polytunnels and our glass houses, we feed with compost. All of our outdoor production, the main source of fertility, and one of the key techniques we use for growing stuff is cover crops, green manures, living mulches. I see them all as being the same thing, those three. But for the purposes of this, we'll call them cover crops for the purposes of this presentation. So we'll get straight into the detail, really. So cover crops, what are they? They're a living crop used as a multifunctional tool in sustainable agriculture. They really are, for me, a wide-ranging toolbox of possibilities. And I'm going to cover as many of those as possible in this presentation. We've got a wide demographic of skill levels and knowledge, I know, within the group here this evening. So I know we're going from new entrants all the way through to very experienced growers. So I'm going to try and have a bit of something for everyone, basically. So we're going to talk about practical, really practical kind of start of the process knowledge about how to use them, but I'm going to include some more advanced techniques we use as well. So cover crops, they can be single species or multi-species. And definitely on our farm, we use them at the beginning of rotations, before any cash cropping. We use them during cash cropping phases, and we use them after cash cropping phases. So they're integrated in, and this is both inside and outside. All of our areas of production, we use green manures. And we use, as far as what that means plants-wise, we use annuals, we use perennials, we use legumes, grasses, herbs, and wildflowers in all of our mixes. And like I said, toolbox of techniques, we use different things at different times. What can they do? Well, this is it. This is how multifaceted they are. They can add organic matter to your system. They are really important for their roots and their root exudates. We use them to build fertility. We use them to recycle fertility all the way through the rotation. We use them to protect the soil, both during and after cropping. For me, they're an absolutely critical part of my natural pest management strategies. We use them to manage weeds. Just as an organic grower, there's always weeds about, but sometimes things get a little bit out of control, especially perennial weeds. And we use green manures in a really specific way to manage problem weeds, especially pernicious perennials. And they're also a fantastic way of repairing damaged soil and preventing damage to soil. So I'm going to go through all of those one by one. So adding organic matter, as an organic grower, I just think this is the most important subject there is, really. You know, as organic growers, what we're trying to do is mimic natural processes. And the most important part of that is soil. Essentially, soil is organic matter, or in brackets, things that were once living that are now dead, lands on the surface of the ground, and soil life mixes that organic matter with minerals, rock dust from the underlying geology of wherever you are. And that is the most fundamental process for me that we must enhance and mimic to grow really good organic crops. It's organic matter that feeds soil life. And that's a really important thing to understand. If we don't keep adding organic matter to the system, that soil life will slowly eat and deplete the organic matter levels in the soil to the extent where you will end up with, if you leave it too long, you'll end up with very little or no organic matter. And it's that constant adding of organic matter and breaking down of organic matter that gives you really long-term, stable, steady release of nutrients throughout the rotation. And if you're bottom right, this is a very simple summary of what an average soil looks like. But all parts of that sort of diagram there. So, and the most interesting thing there is air is 25%, water is 25%, and organic matter is a tiny bit of that, but a really important part of that. Without the organic matter, you wouldn't have those air spaces in the soil, and your soil wouldn't be able to hang on to the water it needs to grow your crops. Roots and root exudates. I always say that, you know, there really isn't anywhere where there's soil on earth, there are roots. If there's no plants, no roots, there is no soil really. That's when you get a desert. So the last place as growers, what we want to create is a desert. We want to create nice organic matter levels. And roots are really important. They're constantly growing and dying. And it's that process that keeps the soil aerated and allows water to pass through the soil. Roots are also a really important bridge through the soil profile, like vertically from top to bottom through those layers of soil. When they're alive, that helps to mobilize nutrients through the soil profile. But when they're dead, it's those gaps in the soil that allow air and water to move up and down through the soil profile. And in that water is soluble nutrients and allows them to move around in the soil. Root exudates are, for me, one of the most important parts of soil life. Like it says here, up to 20% of carbon from photosynthesis is given away as root exudates, depending on what plant type and how healthy your soil is. Plants wouldn't be giving away that valuable resource unless there's a really good reason to do so. And that reason is symbiotic relationships with soil life. And that's really, you know, the more and more we learn about plants and the more and more we learn about soil life, it's that relationship between the two that's driving everything in an organic system, in organic soils. Roots and root exudates are also really important. There's a lot of talk about carbon sequestration these days in regenerative and organic farming. If your carbon is very shallow in the soil profile, that's a very live, very dynamic cycle. There isn't much sequestration going on in the very top layer of the soil. Carbon sequestration happens at depth, and roots down through the soil profile are a really important way of getting that carbon down to a level where it is actually sequestered. So perhaps the most commonly talked about use of cover crops is building fertility. That is done in a number of ways. So that is the obvious one everyone talks about is nitrogen fixation with legumes. So that's that symbiotic relationship between nodules of bacteria in the roots, fixing nitrogen from the air. Like I talked about before, I almost, to be honest, these days I see adding organic matter is almost a more important source of nitrogen than legumes. Nitrogen fixed through legumes is very, very dynamic and can be lost very, very quickly. Organic matter releases nitrogen into the soil very slowly and steadily and all the way through your rotation. Nutrient retrieval is also a really important thing for me. Many nutrients are highly soluble. Most veg crops are incredibly shallow rooted. And many nutrients, especially nitrogen, but potassium, sulfur, magnesium, they can all get washed down below the rooting depth of most of our vegetables very, very quickly. And we can use cover crops to either keep the nutrients high in the soil profile where the veg can reach them, or we can use long-term green manures to go down through the soil profile past veg roots and bring those nutrients back to the surface where our veg crops can access them. And going back to that concept of creating soil and building soil, weathering of minerals, parent materials, so that the rocks beneath your soil in the subsoil, Roots are a really important part of breaking that down, as our root exudates, especially on my soil, where we've only got about 15 centimeters of it, and then we're into minerals, really. That's happening all the time for me. Another really important, and this is for me, this is everything. We talked about, I talked about how dynamic many nutrients are, how soluble they are, and how quickly they can get washed down past our vegetable rooting depth. This is just a quick demonstration of how we manage that on our farm in one snapshot in one field. We have I have two different field scale rotations. This is a snapshot of one of them where we grow potatoes, we grow short season summer brassicas, and then we grow root crops. We do a 3-year multi-species cover crop, clovers and grasses and chicories and lucerne, all sorts of other things, wildflowers in there. We spend 3 years building soil health and adding lots of nutrients to the soil. We then incorporate that into the soil, and the first crop in the rotation is our main crop potatoes, about all our potatoes, new potatoes, main crop. We grow that crop, we harvest that crop. That crop doesn't use anything like all the nutrients that we've put into the soil. So once we cut that foliage down, and that we can see in that photo, loads, the potatoes take up a load of the nutrients. We harvest those potatoes, but that foliage and the nutrients still in the soil, they're still there. There's lots there, and I want that for the following brassica crop. So we use an overwintered green manure after those potatoes to mop up all those nutrients and keep them nice and high in the soil profile, ready for the next brassica crop. We then terminate that green manure in the spring, and all those nutrients are released back into the soil for the brassica crop to use them again. And we do that all the time. That brassica crop, we then undersow with a cover crop, and that keeps those nutrients high in the soil profile. And then when we finish harvesting brassicas, the undersow lasts all the way through the winter. We then terminate that the following year and release those nutrients again to be used by root crops like carrots and parsnips and beetroot. Cover crops are really important, especially as we get more and more. And I hear you've had really, really heavy rain today. Whatever the weather is happening at the moment, it's getting more and more severe, more and more intense. And cover crops are a really important technique for helping us protect our soils. So in these photos, whether it be heavy rain and washing all your soil out the gate, as in top left photo, for us, when we're having more and more droughts in the UK, and something that comes with those droughts is strong winds. And we're getting both water erosion in the winter if you don't look after your soil, but we're getting a lot of wind erosion in the summer during the droughts as well. Flooding is a more and more common occurrence here, as I imagine it is there as well. Cover crops are a really important way of protecting your soil and repairing your soil after floods. And bottom line, if you want to protect your soil, never have bare soil. We should be avoiding bare soil at all times, and cover crops is the easiest, quickest, and most effective way to do that. And just what we find, if we get our cover crops right, and again, springs are becoming harder and harder to do basic ground prep for us. We've had 2 of the wettest years and the driest year on record in the last 3 years. Wherever we've got good cover crops in over the winter, it makes it so much easier to get out on the ground early and do early ground preparation, especially for crops like main crop onions and potatoes, where we're going out really early, like mid-March, early March. I want to be looking to do ground prep. If it's bare ground, it's hard to get it going. If it's got a cover crop in it, we can get out on it really early and get it prepped really early. As a tool for natural pest management, and I know you've got a presentation. I'm not sure when it's up. Your next presentation is all about this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but for me, the most important currency for that is pollen. Everyone talks about pollen and pollinators. Actually, as you know, most vegetable crops that we harvest on our systems don't need pollination. Fruit does. Most veg crops don't need pollination. For seed, they do. But if you're just growing the crops, they don't. For me, pollen's the most important thing about pollen is it's my currency for dealing with predatory insects. So trees and natural wildflowers will give you pollen from January, February, all the way through until sort of mid-July. Once you go past mid-July, nature doesn't really do pollen. So for me, my cover crops in the fields and my undersowings, anywhere where I'm growing them, I'll talk about it later. We actively manage them for this reason, are my key source of pollen for feeding predatory insects. So they're really important tool for me with that aspect. There's a tool for managing weeds. So basically, it's the same with pest management. Nature hates a vacuum. If you create a vacuum, if you have no life in your field, then life will move into that field. You're not going to stop it. And if you don't have lots of life in there, generally bad life moves in, like aphids, like cabbage white butterflies. It's the same with weeds. The worst pernicious perennial weeds are all colonizing species. So couch grass, creeping thistle. If you maintain bare ground around your crops or either side of growing your crops, that's when these weeds will move in. So we really use cover crops all the way through our rotations to never have blank space and to allow yeah, diversity keeps things in balance essentially. And I'll talk again more later about some of the techniques we use in different situations to manage weeds. And that's both whilst establishing green manures, but also the reason we use green manures to stop having that bare ground. And repairing damaged ground. These days, what we find is no matter what we do, with the extreme weather conditions we get, even with the best, even using the best management practices, we still end up with damaged ground. Sometimes, you've got to earn a living, you've got to be commercial. There's times where you've got to break some of the rules just to get a crop in the ground, and that can lead to soil damage. In fact, I would say that veg farming in general is an inherently damaging process for soils. So always having to rebuild soil health at the end of rotations or during rotations, and green manure is an absolutely key way of doing that. And again, I'll talk later on about how we use green manures for dealing with soil-borne pests and diseases. So how do we use them? So first of all, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, but you need to do what we call objective setting. So what am I trying to achieve with my green manures? What species will help me achieve that? How do we prepare our ground for green manures? How and when do we sow them? What are the key things to think about when you're establishing them? How do we manage them once they're growing? And then how do we terminate them when we want to release those nutrients for the following cash crops? So we'll look at those in a bit more detail. So what am I trying to achieve? I think this is really important, otherwise this is where it gets really interesting and really creative. And you can use different species mixes to achieve different things. Now, many green manures will achieve all of these things at the same time, and we often use them for that purpose. But there are situations where we do really want to really focus in on one of these techniques. And again, I'll talk about these each in turn. So there's times when we really do want to fix nitrogen. By the end of my rotation, the nitrogen levels have dropped. It's a very dynamic nutrient or volatile nutrient. We can lose it into the air very quickly on hot days, and we can lose it below the rooting depth of our crops in heavy rains through leaching. Building organic matter, as I discussed, I think is the most important thing about an organic system. Recycling nutrients, I've talked about, how important it is once you've built that soil health and those nutrients to keep it going around in a cycle and keep it up shallow in the soil profile. Protecting and repairing soil, natural pest management, and weeds, and how we look after all of those, how we target our green manures at all of these things. So we'll look at these in a bit more depth from a practical perspective. So nitrogen fixation. So we're talking about legumes here, really. So whether it be clovers or many of the other legumes that you can use, there's some absolutely key principles. Definitely when I 17, 18 years ago, when I started being an organic grower, there was a sort of common misconception that if you grew croppable legumes like broad beans or climbing beans or, dwarf French beans in your rotation, that would help you build nitrogen. What I now know is that's not the case. If you grow loads of broad beans or you grow climbing beans or dwarf French beans and you harvest all of the beans, that's actually where most of the nitrogen is. So nitrogen is a key building block for proteins, and beans are full of proteins. So most of the nitrogen that you create when you grow these legume cash crops, you actually take out of the field when you harvest the beans. So they will fix a bit of nitrogen, but you can't rely on that as being your only way of building nitrogen in the soil, because you're actually taking most of it away when you harvest the crop. In terms of how quickly you can build nitrogen, We use mixes that build significant amounts of nitrogen in. Oh, I just lost my screen. Hang on. Significant amounts of nitrogen in 10 weeks. And we're talking, the key thing there is if you're building nitrogen in the soil or you're fixing it from the atmosphere, you need very active bacteria attached to its roots. That does not happen all year round. You know, all chemistry is governed by temperature, and that's no difference for the chemistry in the soil and the chemistry in the life in the soil or associated with the roots of the plants. For us, there's a key nitrogen fixation season, and that is between April and September, when the soils are warm and everything is vibrant and alive in that soil. So I only really see, even if I've got clovers in over the winter, and you can see this really clearly. If you dig up clovers outside of that period, you dig up clovers in November or in January, you won't see any nodules on those roots because they're not fixing nitrogen during that period. They'll be holding it in their foliage, but they won't be actively fixing more nitrogen. So that's what you want to do. Focus on those warm summer months when everything's really active in the soil. If you're trying to build organic matter, this is not something that's done quickly. You're not going to build serious amounts of organic matter in 10 weeks in between two cash crops in the summer. To be honest, you're not going to build serious amounts of organic matter in 1 year of fertility building. So we never have a period of less than 2 years of fertility building before a crop. And in fact, because we don't use any farmyard manures or composts on our outdoor cropping, we actually quite often use 3 years of fertility building at the beginning of the rotation in order to ensure we're building really healthy levels of organic matter. And for me, one of the key kinds of plants we use to do that is grasses. And the one we really love here is cocksfoot. So we put cocksfoot in all of our mixes. It's a really carbon heavy, lots of foliage above ground. And if you go 2-3 years, cocksfoot can go down at least 2 meters into the soil. And that does all those things you want to do around organic matter building, fracturing the soil, keeping it aerated, lots of root exudates. And if you're trying to do that, and it sounds pretty obvious, but you don't want to crop it. You don't want to harvest it for silage. And this is a really important thing for new entrants. If you're taking on a new bit of land and you rent it off someone, try not to let them take a silage or a hay crop off the land before you take it on. That's quite often what they want to do, especially in this country. You want them to leave that in the field because that's your fertility for your first rotation of veg growing. Like I said, 2 years minimum for building organic matter the way we see it. And we use deep-rooted grasses, but we also use things like sandfoin, and the one we absolutely love is chicory. We have chicory in all of our fertility building phases. Really good at retrieving nutrients from depth, incredibly drought resistant. And again, really deep, so it fractures the soil and keeps it really well aerated, injects those root exudates as deep as possible. If you want to recycle nutrients, so this is kind of, I'm talking about in the middle of the rotation here. So this is in between cash cropping years. If it's summer crops like potatoes or onions, we really want to look after that soil between crops. And that's generally over the winter we're talking about here. Like I said, nutrients are incredibly volatile and lots of them are very, very soluble. So if you want to recycle nutrients, you need to act pretty quick. So actually, we will sometimes, if I'm honest, we design our systems to grow our crops, our cash crops, hard and fast, get them out of the ground. I mean, potatoes, we do this to avoid blight as well. We get them in and we grow them as hard and fast as possible with lots of irrigation and get them out as quickly as possible. Onions are the same. Onions will always end in August anyway, so it's quite easy for us. But yeah, we want to get a cover crop there as soon as possible after the cash crop has come out. And then sometimes, which I'll come on to, we'll get it in there before the cash crop has come out. As far as recycling, you want to be quick. So you want something that grows fast and mops up nutrients quickly and gives you a good stand before winter sets in and the autumn rains come like it started at the moment. So you want to match the species to the situation. That's really, really important. I'll talk about species choice in a minute. But generally for recycling nutrients, you want something quick. So you can mop up nutrients before they get washed down through the soil profile. And then when you've done that and you come back round to the following year and you've got your next cash crop coming, you want to try and time the release of those nutrients. And again, it's the same as mopping them up. You don't want to mop them all up, look after the nutrients through the winter, and then just prepare all of your cropping ground at the beginning of the spring and then not plant something into it for a month and a half. If you do get heavy rain in that situation on bare soil, all those nutrients you've mopped up are going to get leached out of your soil pretty quick, especially nitrogen. You're going to lose that quick if you get heavy rain between destroying cover crops and then planting your cash crop. So, and this, I have to be honest, this gets harder and harder with climate change and very, very wet springs and summers, but we just don't know what we're going to get. For me, as a rough rule of thumb, it's 2 weeks before I want the ground. That's my starting point and my attitude. If the weather looks iffy, we might extend that a little bit further, but that's what we're, textbook 2 weeks before the crop goes in. And by the time that allows allelopathic effect to dissipate, probably allows you to do one weed strike and then put your cash crop in before the nutrients have been leached out the soil. Protecting the soil. So what are you protecting it from? Well, everything. Heavy rain. We find that if we have green manures in the ground or we undersow our crops with green manures, we don't really get compaction from heavy rain. The soils are alive, and if they're kept aerated by the living roots in the soil, and that feeding a soil life, a soil that is alive will protect itself. It's the same in droughts. We find if we've got cover crops in the ground, they help kind of keep the soil nice and living, stop it cracking really wide open, stop it from baking really hard on the soil surface, which then when we do get the rain, all the rain just washes off. If we have a green manure in there and we get heavy rain during a drought, we find that rain will penetrate the soil and soak into the soil way better than if there's nothing living around our crops. And a big reason we use green manures, and I'll come on to this again in a bit, undersowing brassicas. So long season brassicas, we undersow all of them when we can, and that alleviates the foot traffic. Things like kales, by definition for us, Brussels sprouts are always harvested right in the middle of winter when the soil is absolutely saturated, and we're quite often doing it in heavy rain. And that foot traffic is massively alleviated if there's a living cover crop underneath those plants. And I keep emphasizing it, but we're always feeding the soil at every point we can, both with organic matter, but with root exudates as well, just always keeping that soil alive and vibrant. So natural pest management. So, and I mentioned this earlier, so the aim of using cover crops is they will provide me a pollen source. Generally, we will have cover crops flowering somewhere in all of our fields at some point from April all the way through to October. And we deliberately manage the cutting of our cover crops to achieve this aim. So we'll either have multiple areas of cover crop in the field, and we'll ensure we never cut them all at the same time. We'll cut them in succession. So there's always a big area of at least, a third of a hectare in the field scale rotations, always a third of a hectare in a field with lots and lots of flowers, lots and lots of pollen building up those predatory insect levels. Even within one cover crop, so you look at bottom left, this is how we cut our cover crops. So we'll go in there and cut them in stripes, ensuring that, and this is at the beginning, this is an established cover crop. We use Phacelia as a nurse crop and sometimes buckwheat to come up quickly and suppress weeds. And then we cut that and clovers come up from underneath. But when we do that first cut, we'll go in a little bit earlier and cut every other kind of tractor width. And then what that means is for the rest of that growing season, that's how we cut that green manure. And that's just within one area of green manure, that ensures there's always some of it flowering, basically. And in fact, I'm less and less fussy about allowing some of my green manures to go to seed, basically. And the reason I'm less and less fussy is I find, the longer I'm here, the longer I do that, the more diverse the seed bank in the soil gets. And, it's nice to have. I don't see clovers as weeds. I don't see Phacelia as weeds. I see them as such a beneficial thing for crop production. It's quite nice to have those seeds in my seed bank. And I now proactively do that. As far as dealing with weeds is concerned, for this is the way I deal with cooch, and I deal with creeping thistle. Not so much docks. We're not too bad with docks because we don't mix with livestock. We find keeping on top of docks quite easy in our rotations. But the ones we have problems with are creeping thistle and cooch grass. And this is the process we do. Okay, if we identify we've got a perennial weed problem, before, and I didn't quite often, this is what we're looking at the end of the rotation. We will, in the spring when we look to establish our fertility builds, we'll spend a bit of time, we'll delay the sowing of the fertility build till maybe late May, early June. And we'll spend some time physically disrupting, removing, dragging to the surface with harrows, creeping thistle and couch grass. And we'll do that from, maybe at 3 or 4 cultivations. And then we'll put in a very fast competitive cover crop and establish it really keenly to outcompete it. And then again, we keep the kind of foot down on the pedal, and we then establish at the beginning of the rotation a very competitive cash crop. Normally for that, that's either potatoes or it's brassicas, basically something that puts the ground into deep shade. Neither creeping thistle nor couch grass like being outcompeted or being put in the dark. So we use both those techniques to deal with pernicious perennial weeds. Biofumigation. Okay, so this is, and there's a number of ways we use this. We use it actively against wireworm. We have some of our fertility builds are 3 years long with grasses in for 3 year long, 3 years long, 3 years long. I know this is borderline risky for wireworm. So we quite often will break halfway through the 3rd year, maybe in sort of June or July. And actually before potatoes, we will grow a mixture of mustard and buckwheat. And this has a really disrupting effect on wireworm life cycles. We actually don't get any wireworm. So we're almost doing this as a preventative just to make sure that doesn't happen. The other things you can do this for is we use brassicas against, it's a 27-year-old veg operation. We're building up some of the more pernicious diseases that come with time. So we got verticillium wilt, we've got a bit of sclerotinia, and in the intensive market garden, we've got a bit of white rot. We use brassicas, often mustard, but we use caliente mustard, a very, very, very strong mustard that's been bred specifically for biofumigation. And we find that knocks back verticillium wilt and it knocks back sclerotinia long enough for us to grow good crops that are affected by those diseases. So species selection. So again, what should lead this is what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to fix nitrogen, you're looking for legumes. If you want to build organic matter, you're looking for stuff that puts on lots of foliage and lots of rooting mass. That organic matter is created above ground and below ground. If you're trying to recycle nutrients, you want fast growing crops, but you also want quite deep rooting crops as well. And if you're trying to retrieve nutrients, you want very deep rooting crops. You're talking about sainfoin, lucerne, plantain, cocksfoot, sweet clover is another one that's very deep rooting. You need to understand what species grow in what soil conditions. So understanding the pH requirements of the different green manure species is really important. The length of time you're going to grow them for is really important. We don't find there's much point in putting cocksfoot in mixes if it's for 10 weeks. Even 1 year, you don't get too much performance out of cocksfoot. It's year 2 and it's year 3 where the grasses really come into their own, especially for things like organic matter. Frost hardiness is really important. Things like buckwheat are not frost hardy. We find mature Phacelia plants not frost hardy, but young ones are. So understanding how the different species behave in different weather conditions is really important. Also, sowing date is really important. Like I said, if you're putting in an overwintered green manure and it's only going to be in, the cash crop doesn't come out until mid-October, and you're going to be working it in March, there's no point in buying really expensive legume seeds to put in over winter when they're not going to fix any nitrogen at all. You're better off using things like ryegrass or Phacelia or some of the cereal crops to mop up those nutrients. Legumes, if they're not going to do any nitrogen fixing, they're an expensive option over winter. And we generally, it's very rare for us to use single species mixes. We find you get way more benefits if you can mix species. And that is my basic mixes. So 2 or 3 year fertility build, that's what we put in there. Cocksfoot for organic matter, chicory to add real depth, sandfoin for real depth. Red clover fixes more nitrogen than any other clovers. White clover we find fills in the bottom of the green manure mix, really helps to shade out weeds. Same with yellow trefoil. Vetch we put in there for diversity. It's also a legume. Crimson clover, great for natural pest management. We get in the first year, we get lovely flowers off the crimson clover, and that is the same with Persian. Sweet clover is lovely. It's got good flowers. It's very deep rooting. It fixes nitrogen. Phacelia we use as a nurse crop. So what I mean by that is when we sow any green manure, we always chuck Phacelia in the mix, and that grows up really, really fast, shades out other weeds, but it creates a sort of nursery environment for the other things in that mix to establish slowly. Obviously, it flowers beautifully, especially if that mixes in over winter. We get a really early pollen hit off the Phacelia in the spring. And we always chuck wildflower mix into our 2-3 year fertility builds. And that's part of restoring that natural seed bank of lots of diversity. But it also, you know, all different plants release different sort of root exudates, have different symbiotic relationships with different soil life. So having that diversity is really, really important. That's the summer mix, which is just mostly clovers, and that's about building nitrogen quickly. We'll sometimes use that summer mix if we've got a bit of time in the autumn and in the spring the following year when the soils are warm. We might use that mix as an overwintered green manure mix, but only if we're going to get a good 8 weeks of nitrogen fixing soil temperatures in the autumn and in the spring. Our basic under-sowing mix to go with brassicas is white clover and yellow trefoil. And then if we get into sort of, I'd say once we get to the beginning of October onwards, and we're looking just to protect the soil through the winter, we generally use Phacelia and ryegrass as our just sort of standard overwintered mixes. So preparing the ground for green manures, basically we prepare the ground in the same way we prepare for vegetables. So I put there in accordance with your system. So whatever you normally do, you know, we will in our market garden, we use black plastic to kill off green manures. So if we've got a crop in there, we'll often use black plastic to kill off lots of weeds, take the black plastic off, establish a green manure. In the field scale operations, we use a plow, give us a nice clean seed bed. Like I said, if it's a long-term green manure, we always spend a bit of time knocking back perennial weeds. Once we're happy we've knocked them back, we always like to get one stale seed bed out before we put in the green manure. So we'll get one flush of annual weeds, knock them back, and then put the green manure in. And it's like sowing carrots. You want a nice, fine tilth. Really rough ground's not what you want for quick, efficient establishment. So when to sow? You want to give the same level of focus as a high value crop, you know, because I don't use any compost or farm manures in my outdoor rotations. We use a little bit on some of the hungrier crops, but generally as a rule of thumb, they're not a major part of the rotation's fertility. We give those green manures the same level of focus as our cash crops. It's a really important part of our process. Like I said, we'll sow into warm soil from May onwards. We'll only fix nitrogen between May and October, so we target mixes accordingly. My cut-off dates for sowing things. So last sowings, legumes, if it's after the end of September, I don't sow legumes unless they're going through into a long-term fertility build the next year. Grasses and Phacelia, really, I'll try and have all of my overwintered green manures in by the end of October, just so I can get them established enough to mop up enough nutrients. As far as when we sow we do under-sowing, that's when the cash crop is well established. And I say the cash crop is the dominant species in the locality, then we'll undersow. You always want the cash crop to be the strongest, most dominant thing. And like I said before, you want to be aware of frost tender green manures. How do you sow? And this depends on your scale. We can sow with little earthway manual seeders. We do sometimes broadcast by hand, but we don't find that the most efficient way of doing it. I do a lot of manual broadcasting with that device in the photo. On the field scale, we'll do either tractor mounted broadcasting, or occasionally, if the contractor's on the farm doing the arable, we'll get them in and drill it with a tractor. Like I said, for establishment, we try and stale seedbed before establishment. We're looking for fast, competitive establishment to outcompete weeds. If it's dry, we will use irrigation to establish green manures. And we always time the first cut to kill unwanted annuals. So basically, what we find is everything tears up at once when we sow a green manure. That includes the green manure, but often, because we're in the warm months of the year, that will include lots of real heavy annual seeders like fat hen and redshank will come up. And obviously, we can't mechanically weed them. So we wait until they are as big as possible, but the seeds aren't viable. And then we'll cut that green manure at 30 centimeters high to take off all those seed heads on things like fat hen and redshank. And they progress through time. So that's a quick image. Like after 6 weeks, the Phacelia nurse crop, you can see this come up lovely. We do the first cut. And in year one, that's what our long-term fertilities look like. Lots of clovers, all sorts of diversity. But as we go into year 2 or year 3, the more dominant things come through. So things like grasses and the chicory and the red clover really dominate from year 2 onwards. So they kind of evolve these mixes. As far as management's concerned, like I said, we allow the crops to flower before they seed. We tend to try and cut them at around 30 to 40 centimeters high. Depending on your scale, we'll use a flail, a topper, on market garden or inside strimmers or mowers. We always cut the fields from the inside out, so that as we're cutting, any wildlife in that field is pushed to the outside. If you go round and round a field and work to the middle, you basically round up all the wildlife, and then the last strike across the field, you kill it all. So work from the inside out. We try and cut in sequence, as I said, to keep something flowering all the time. And as we go into winter, we try and let green manures get as high as possible to give us as much protection on the soil as possible for winter. Termination and incorporation is kind of the same as the ground preparation. So whatever you normally do. So in the market garden, we'll terminate green manures with silage plastic. On a field scale, depending on the weather, it's very dry and it's a short-lived green manure. We can go in there and just do a well-timed couple of power harrows, and that'll kill it off. If it's 2 or 3 year mix, we always plow it. We find plowing it and putting it underground is the best way to incorporate grasses, especially really well-established cocksfoot and chicory. Something we don't do so much of, but I know there's a lot of interest in market gardening these days, is manual crimping. And I'm happy to chat about that in the questions afterwards. Same on a field scale, tractor crimping. Again, we don't do a lot of that. I like multi-species mixes, which don't crimp very well. Crimping works on kind of single species like ryegrass, really. Something we're doing a lot of experiments with on the farm is strip tillage. So again, if you're interested in that, I can talk about that at the end. We use them outside and inside green manures. So any tall growing summer long season crops in polytunnels and glasshouses. So I'm talking tomatoes, peppers, aubergines, climbing beans, cucumbers, early courgettes. We undersow all of these. The lower ones, like peppers and aubergines, and actually tomatoes, because we wind them down, we use a white clover and trefoil mix. The taller crops, like climbing beans, cucumbers, we actually use multi-species mixes. So we use all sorts of clovers, and we regularly mow and manage those. The way we do that is generally we establish those green manures inside at the same time as we plant the crop. And the reason we do that is we want them to be established so we can walk on them before we have to go in there and start pruning tomatoes or pruning peppers or winding the beans on or get round to harvesting things. We need those green manures established well. Undersowing outside. So we undersow brassicas, we undersow leeks. I'll come on to sweet corn and squash in a minute, but basically our general rule of thumb for those crops, and this is all about protecting the soil through the winter, especially from foot traffic from harvest, we will undersow with white clover and trefoil. And we basically do 2 really well-timed tractor weeds on the crops. This is brassicas mainly. And then straight after the second weeding, We'll broadcast white clover and trefoil over the field, and we'll either let that get rained in if there's rain on the horizon, or we'll actively use irrigation to water that in. And that irrigation will wash it down a little bit through the soil profile and allow it to germinate. And it gives us that nice time break. After the second weed, there's normally quite a long time before we're going to start harvesting it. So it allows that green manure to establish itself before we need to start walking on the soil. And then something we do a lot of is something called relaying. So a really good example, at the end of one of our field scale rotations, we grow sweet corn and squash. Just like with the brassicas, we'll do our last weed on those crops. So in the case of sweet corn, that is probably the third weed on sweet corn, and that's just as the tractor can't get over it anymore. And then we'll broadcast, we actually broadcast our full fertility build mix. So our 2-3 year mix, we broadcast across the sweet corn. And again, we either let it get rained in or we irrigate that in. And it's the same with the squash. This is winter squash on a field scale. Just before it starts running across the field, we will do the last weed. And I quite often like put all the runners in a line straight down the field, do one last weed, and literally get off the tractor, turn around, and broadcast the green manure straight across that squash crop. And again, irrigate or water it in. Cut and carry. So we do this quite a lot with tunnel crops. So we'll have an area of green manure, a fertility build, and we might take a strip of it and regularly mow it and then move it somewhere else and mulch plants. We're experimenting doing this with peppers and getting really good results at the moment. We do it quite a lot with courgettes. We get less mildew, we find, if we mulch around the courgettes, especially early on before we undersow them. We do this quite a lot. And then again, so this is long-term trials we're running at the farm. So strip tilling into a living mulch. So basically what we do is we establish a green manure mix. We grow it for a year, and then the following year we cultivate 30-centimeter wide strips into the living mulch, and then we grow our crops into those strips. I will quickly say this is not a perfected system. This is definitely experimental, but there's lots of farmers getting into this and trialing it. We can make it work on legume crops. So we've grown broad beans really well like this, climbing beans really well like this, but we've struggled with crops like brassicas and cucurbits. We're still not hitting commercial yields, but it has lots of benefits. You know, we don't have to have fertility building phases if we've always got a living crop in the ground. It offers really good natural pest management possibilities. It offers really good climate change, weather resilience. And yeah, there's lots of positives. We just haven't quite managed to achieve commercial yields. And we don't quite understand the reason yet, whether it's biological to do with soil life, whether it's chemical to do with nitrogen availability and competition between the cash crop and the cover crop. But yeah, we're going to keep trialing and see if we can make it work. And then this is the last slide. So I always say the cover crop is the accountant's least favorite crop. Basically, they can never understand why we're not growing a cash crop in the field and growing a cover crop. However much you explain soil health to an accountant, they never understand. But this simple math shows that why we do it. So we reckon on a 5-year rotation, where the rotation areas are each half a hectare, these are our costs. We reckon it's a total cost of £265, and in return for that fertility and that soil health, we make those yields on average and that income from those crops. So financially, it's a no-brainer. It stops you having to cart around loads and loads of farmyard manure on big, heavy muck spreaders. And in fact, I think it's even worse in the market garden, where you've got to cart around loads and loads of compost, especially if you're no dig. And I think at least working in some cover crops helps reduce that labor requirement. And that is me done. So I'm going to stop there and field questions.
Yeah, well, fair play, Andy. The title of this webinar was Intelligent Use of Green Manures, and you definitely used them intelligently and communicated it really intelligently as well. So fair play on that presentation. And I'm sure we'll have a few more questions. It was funny, I was jotting down questions as we we're going along, but you actually sequentially got to everything throughout the presentation. But I see, yeah, and if anyone has any other, things of interest you want to talk about, but I know someone threw in earlier about terminating the crops, but you did actually go through in your presentation, you know, what machinery you're using. So I think that was covered as well. And then, yeah, the strip tillage is really interesting as well. And I know you were mentioning you were going over to a gathering in Denmark when we were there. Was that right, on strip tillage?
Yeah, in fact, I'm going there on Friday, and in fact, they've got something. This It's such a diverse technique, cover crops, and everyone, as people get more and more into them all over the world, people are coming up with more and more inventive techniques. In fact, the technique in Denmark that I'm going to look at is really interesting. That is these new plant module planters called mulch tech, and what they do is what this farm is doing is they are growing both in the field where at the beginning of the rotation, but also in the field next door. They're growing big green manure crops. They're then harvesting them into silage trailers, and they're rebroadcasting them out over the ground in a very thick mulch. No cultivation of the field, and they've got a planter that can go into that mulch and plant through the mulch. They're getting really, really good results. In fact, they're getting better results from that than we're getting off strip tillage. So it's all about you know, although I'm not against tillage, if we can reduce tillage, it's got to be better for our soil life. So it's the age-old subject of, like, you know, regenerative, especially regenerative arable is gone no tillage, but it revolves around Roundup, which I'm just not up for using. And I'm obviously I can't because I'm organic, but I wouldn't want to use it anyway. I think it's a poison essentially. So anyway, organic, like the holy grail of organic, is how do we do field scale production and minimize tillage without chemicals? So there's lots of strip tillage is one way we might be doing that. Large scale application of mulches. And again, no one's got enough compost to do no dig on a field scale at 10 acres, 15 acres. So we need creative ways of growing the mulch in situ if we're going to use a deep mulching technique. And this seems to be something they're making work in Denmark.
Yeah, which is brilliant. And as you say, regenerative organic is the ultimate. So
Yeah.
yeah, look at researching that on scale. I see, yeah, you put up a nice photo there of an earthway cedar, what you use, your preferred use method over hand use. And then I think what's Seamus, what would you use the earthway cedar to seed? Is your, yeah, that's a good question.
So I might use the earthway cedar. We'd probably use, like, a good example of that is if you're on a market garden, you can use that for under-sowing brassicas. So you can get, and you know, broadcasting, and again, I've got to get so much into these presentations. Broadcasting is great, it's quick. You can see a rain cloud on the horizon, grab your broadcaster, run out, and sow a crop and make use of that rain. However, as far, you know, green manure seed can be expensive. Our rule of thumb is if we're going out and broadcasting, we add from what the catalogue says about sowing rate, we'll add 30% to the mix to offset the fact that we're broadcasting it. So if you can ever do it with a seed drill instead, you will use less green manure seed and it'll be more targeted, and the seed drill will work it into the soil as you go. Whereas if you're broadcasting, broadcasting is nature's way, you know. Naturally, plants just drop the seed on the surface and rain washes it down. So that's what we're mimicking, but you can be more efficient and therefore more cost efficient if you can use a seed drill instead. So the earthway, we do that. We could do that around, if I was on a market garden scale, I'd do that around sweet corn, squash, courgettes. Generally, under-sowing is when I'd use that. You could also establish fertility builds like that on a small scale as well.
Yeah, that covers that. And then the crimping as well. I can see Jim Cronin there. I don't know if you would know Jim, one of our legendary growers and teachers for a number of years. Jim, I don't know if you want to unmute and come in on anything on that. I think Jim's supposed to be having a problem. Yeah. Hello, Jim. How are you?
Yeah. You see what Andy is, hi Andy.
Hi,
what Andy is referring to is kind of a semi-mature crop for crimping. Whereas I'm using this method of rolling very, very young crops. Say, for instance, in a situation where you have you're growing in polytunnels, and you have a quick turnaround. So you take out a crop of lettuce, you quickly put in a single species in order to get a rotation in, maybe getting on top of some issue or other. And then the crop only grows for 21 or 30 days. You roll it in with the next crop. So it's there is a difference between that and crimping.
Yeah.
Jim, what species are you using in that situation, Jim?
So, so I might be using buckwheat to mop up nutrients.
Yeah.
I might use black oats to mop up nitrogen. Very, very short term stuff,
Yeah.
Andy. Very short term. It's what you spoke about, specific use of a cover crop around nutrient, weed control, pest control.
And I presume because they're growing so fast inside as well, they're very lush and quite easy to destroy, yeah?
Yeah, they're very easy to terminate. I just had a question for you. So could you clarify the rye that you're using? You said, did you say grass rye?
If we're doing, we'll use Westerworlds or cereal rye for overwintered. Generally, they're the ones we'll use for overwintered, yeah.
Yeah. Because okay. And I was recently on a great workshop with a guy, and now this is a large scale tillage farmer, and we were looking at ground that was quite damaged and that type of thing, and he was, for a kind of a remedial job we needed to do. This was kind of like late September. He was advocating. Now the window was beginning to close for germination. It was just a window where you could actually sow on a broadacre scale. And he was advocating the use of annual ryegrass. So we're talking about a situation where the ground was quite damaged and we wanted something to cover the ground quite quickly. It was getting late. The whole conversation was around min-till, and we were just basically going to go in with a very sophisticated min-till machine, and we were going to drop in annual ryegrass seed. I thought it was very interesting.
I mean, that rye, interesting. That seems to be the species of choice for people into crimping.
Yeah.
And I think that would be, quite often that is an annual rye. That is an annual rye they're going for, and they get it at milk point. And that is, I think, I think an arable uses is very different, isn't it? I think it's a different mindset with arable.
Yeah. What this guy was going to do now, he had experience of it. He knew what he was talking about. So we had a lot of damage. He was going to go in with his very particular corn drill. He was going to put in annual rye grass seed. He was going to get good germination, and then he was actually going to graze it very lightly with sheep just before Christmas. One quick grazing, take off the sheep, and then he was quite confident that he could terminate it quite easily and still stay in his min-till system without using Roundup.
So did he say how he was going to terminate, Jim?
So he was going to undercut it. He was basically going to undercut it with a particular type of a goosefoot type harrow type machine that he had.
Yeah.
And he was going to bring it up to the surface, and he was going to get tilt that way.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I think he might have been out. I'm not whether for horticulture, but I do work with a guy called Tim Parton over here. He's a sort of regenerative arable. He's a big fan of not so much crimping, but a bit like you said. But this is on a arable of rolling. He'll go out at 3 a.m. in a hard frost.
Yeah.
To roll a crop and terminate it in the winter. So I think that there's many different ways. I especially with green manures, I think it's really important if people can learn the basics. There's so many different ways you can use them to understand the basic principles of it and then be creative around your own situation. And I think, and again, with species mixes, the way I learned was Obviously, a lot of the seed companies will, I work with a company called Cotswold Seeds. They're just up the road from me. And when I was first learning, I'd buy their basic mixes. They've got a summer quick fix for nitrogen. They've got a 2-year humus builder mix. They've got a deep rooting mix. And just through using those to start with. But now I've got a chest freezer full of straight single variety species. It's a little bit like a sweet shop for me. I look at the situation that is in front of me, and then I'll add to my sweet bag the species that I think can achieve those different things. Sometimes multiple different objectives at the same time. But I think it's the same with terminating, establishing, under-sowing. There are so many options. It's such a diverse toolbox of techniques that I'm really into. Like, you give people the basic knowledge and then they can develop it for their own unique situations, essentially.
Yeah, totally. And my final comment, last week we had over here in Ireland, Erwin Westers. I never knew the guy before last week.
No, I've not heard of him.
He is from Groningen in North Holland. He is phenomenal. So he is doing what you described, what the guys are doing in Denmark.
Yeah, they're mulch planting.
This guy is interesting. He's got a few things on YouTube. And
we'll get his name, because it's not Irish anyway.
Erwin, Erwin, Westers. And yeah, he's on it. He's growing the seed crops for Bingheimer.
Yeah, I know. One of the other lovely things I see in the Netherlands is they're starting to do it's all about diversity, but they're now, and again, this is big scale off like sat nav, but they'll have literally on broad acres. So we're talking about 100-acre fields. They'll have a line of carrots, a line of calabrese, a line of sweet corn. They are literally doing every crop family in alternate lines across the field, and they are getting some amazing results. I mean, the Netherlands have always been kind of at the forefront of horticulture. They kind of it's always worth watching what they're doing.
Yeah, and Andy, there's a few more questions now coming in, so we're keeping you busy now tonight. Just one from Aoife in Glasry. Just any issues cutting and terminating cocksfoot? It's chunky grass.
Yes is the simple answer. And actually, for the first time, we've had real problems. So we always plow it. We always, we've mucked around with doing sort of min till. So just going in and, especially in really dry weather, power harrowing a couple of times to kill off green manures if we can. The one thing we never, whatever the weather, we never got much success with is a really well-established cocksfoot, a lay with cocksfoot in it. And then actually we got caught out this year. We had no serious rain on the farm from end of February till the end of August. So you're always living and learning. And where we got caught out is the last bit of brassica ground. We've got our long season overwinter brassicas like sprouts, kales, January king cabbages, all those sorts of things. That's about the last bit of ploughing I do of the year, but they follow a 2-year lay with cocksfoot in it. And by the time we ploughed the last bit up for the latest stuff, so we're talking, what was that? It was like winter kales, last few successions of calabrese, January king cabbages. When we ploughed that up, we were deep into the drought. And basically, it's really interesting, like life needs moisture. So if you want your cover crops to be broken down by soil life, you need moisture in the soil. And even with irrigation, and we ended up resorting to irrigating bare ground to try and get this going, that just as you said, that really, it's very carbon heavy. Cocksfoot, especially like 2 years old, really well established, very clumpy. We couldn't get it to break down. And it wouldn't break down for months and months and months. We went into the field to try and plant. It bunged up the planters. It then bunged up the weeders all the way through the season. And interestingly, it wasn't until we got good rain at the end of August that we really saw it starting to be broken down by the soil life. So that was a new one for us. And having said my answer, like I said, you're always learning, especially with climate change. that is one of those situations now that I think if I saw we were going into drought conditions, I will now quickly get all of my ground ready while there's still a bit of moisture in the soil. I think once you go into deep drought and it's bone dry, those like really well established grass species can be problematic to break down. So yeah, I have had problems.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. And then just you referred to under-sowing squash, and just what mix do you opt for then?
So there's two. So cucurbits in general. So like courgettes, which we do, and again in different situations. But say if I had courgettes mid-rotation, I would go in with and same with squash mid-rotation. I'd go in the white clover, yellow trefoil. Takes quite a long time to establish, but generally with those crops, by the time we get to winter, especially with winter squash, by the time we want to go in and harvest, and in fact, anything we undersow, what we find is it just about establishes, and by the time the crop dies back, the cash crop, it's well established basically. The picture I showed, and I was talking about relaying. So at the end of our rotation where we grow winter squash, we're actually going in with a full fertility build mix of cocksfoot, 5 different kinds of clover, chicory, everything, the full shebang basically. And again, we find that it kind of establishes, but it doesn't really get going. By the time it really gets going, we're taking those squash out of the field. So that'll be for us, we'll clear squash out of the field probably by the end of September normally, by which time that under-sowing green manure really gets going and is really well established by the time we get to kind of like the end of October. And then what that does when you relay a green manure like that, especially the full fertility build, that's in a field where the rotation starts with a 2-year fertility build. By relaying it at the end of the rotation, we get almost an extra sort of 6 months. And the key thing for me with climate change resilience is I've knocked off a ground preparation. I'm not trying to prepare something in the spring. It's a really wet spring or very early drought. Ground preparation becomes really hard. So if we just use that last weeding of the squash crop as the ground preparation, I see it as a climate change resilience technique.
Yeah, brilliant. And I see Tolly was using that system as well. Yeah. And then, another question from Siobhan, just you mentioned in the market garden, you were using tarps to terminate the green manures there. So would you go in with rotivators then or plant direct?
To be honest, it would depend what it looks like when I take the tarp off. So what we try and do, and we're always experimenting with this. So what we've been doing in the past is we'll grow a 2-year green manure. This is in the market garden at the beginning of the rotation. 2 years of green manure. We'll put a tarp down. So generally try and do it kind of like mid-October, early to mid-October. We'll cover the whole area in a silage tarp. We then leave that down all the way through the winter, and then we try and pull the plastic off with the last, it's hard to predict, but with the last hard frost of the year, that we try and get the plastic off and let the hard frost hit that ground under the plastic, because silage plastic is a great place for slugs and slug eggs to hide. So if we get the plastic off, that hard frost will hit them. And then it quite often depends on which bit of the field it is and how much rain there's been. If there's been a lot of rain on that silage tarp, we actually find we can get that the surface can be a little bit compacted underneath that silage plastic. In that situation, we will go in. We don't use a rotavator. We got a 2-wheel tractor with a little power harrow on the back, which we will use. Ideally, I'd like to do no cultivation because that soil, if we could have a tilth there. So actually what we're now looking at is possibly going in with plastic, taking the plastic off and then putting down a layer of compost, essentially almost starting with a no-dig type setup after the green manure. So we don't have to touch that soil structure. So all the benefits of 2 years of roots in the ground and all the organic matter that's been added, we're not immediately going in and cultivating it. We think if we can leave it alone, we'll get more benefits out of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then another good question from Aoife saying they use a lot of green manures for soil cover and a 2-year fertility build, but their soil tests are showing high P levels. And then any thoughts on flowering your green manure specifically to mop up excess pea in the soil?
XSP is a nice thing to have. We don't get that often. What we found, the only time we ever get XSP is when we've been using too much compost. So we found when we are putting our tunnels were no dig for a while before I arrived at the farm. So some of the tunnels have been no dig for about 5 years. Lots of applications of green waste compost, and we were getting P levels of 8 on our soil tests, which is way too high. I think the best way of getting rid of P is to continuously cash crop. Just cash crop, cash crop, cash crop, cash crop. And that's what we did in the polytunnels when we had really high P, and that dropped those levels. But yeah, I think yeah, I'm not sure what would be creating that unless you're putting on a lot of compost. High P levels is yeah, something that I like to find more of, if I'm honest. I find generally people find P is something you struggle with in vegetable systems. So for us, we're bringing more and more wood chip into our system to try and bring P levels up, actually.
And that might come up again, Aoife. We've got Robbie Byrne from Precision Nutrition next week, and he's going to specifically be looking at, reacting to your soil tests. And just before we move on to another question, do ye soil test regularly at Abbey Home Farm?
Yeah, we'll soil test. We soil test at the end of the rotation every year to monitor what's going on. But if I'm absolutely honest, I soil test because I've always been taught to soil test. Where I'm at now, I actually soil test with my eyes by looking at the vigor of my crops. And I think a lot of growers will agree with that soil tests can be misleading. Those soils, so that the more you learn about soil, it's such a dynamic substance. To dig it up, put it in a plastic bag and send it through the post to someone, it's changed by the time it gets there. How long does it sit on the shelf when it gets there? All these things. So I think also it can be misleading. People can and I think this is one of the things with regenerative farming these days. What are you soil testing? Shallow soil, deep soil, organic, some of the organic matter levels people are reporting are frankly outrageous. And that makes me think they're soil testing in the top 10 centimeters, 5 centimeters. And that's so dynamic, you're not going to get any real readings off that. I think, and as an organic grower, whatever your soil test says, the only option you have is to keep adding more organic matter. So, using a lot of amendments regularly around soil tests is starting to drift away from the organic philosophy.
Yeah, makes sense. And then another one on, the polytunnels, and then just how late would you be sowing green manures into your polytunnels?
Depends on the situation. I think very interesting what Jim was saying there about how he used them in his polytunnels. We'll find generally it's longer season polytunnel crops. Tomatoes, we will, and again, I didn't tell about termination, but take tomatoes. We'll plant tomatoes sometime early to mid-April. We'll water them heavily once, wait maybe a week, and then we will, at the second heavy watering, we'll sow the green manure. And then we'll terminate that because I want that tomato bed into another crop for mid-October. So we will often start terminating underneath the tomatoes with black plastic or Mypex or something like that. We'll start doing that in mid-August. So the green manure is well killed off by the time we want to use that bed for autumn and winter crops. So I think, really, we're talking about tomatoes, peppers, aubergines. They're going in like April, May. So we don't do too much establishing after midsummer in the tunnels, I'd say.
Yeah, and I recall from your glasshouse, you had lovely perennial wildflower strips then sowed at different intervals as well.
Yeah.
Which was a nice mix. And I know you're very modest, Andy, and you wouldn't be plugging any of your books, but I am aware that you and Ben Raskin have written a book on silvo horticulture, and we would lovely to get you to speak about that again. And just from your experience on field scale, has the integration of alley crops arose? Does that interrupt with interact with cover crops at all, or, limit?
If I'm really honest, I actually these days I see them as the same thing. Okay, so if you're integrating trees, a lot of the things we learned while researching the book about agroforestry and vegetables, actually I was like, wow, that's actually the same as cover crops. So climate change resilience. I think the key subject is thinking about your growing space 3-dimensionally. So under-sowing crops in many ways, undersowing your brassica crop is very much, it's the same philosophy as growing crops under or near trees. A lot of the benefits are the same: diversity for natural pest management, living roots in the soil for soil health and nutrients, cropping green manures to supply fertility somewhere else. There are so many parallels between the two, just one's on a smaller scale, one's on a bigger scale. So I suppose the key thing is that thinking in 3 dimensions in your cropping, and making the most of natural resources. Any sunlight that goes past, your Brussels sprout plants do not absorb every single bit of sunlight coming down to that soil. If you can have something underneath it growing, that will make use of all that sunlight that's missed your Brussels sprouts and turning it into a beneficial resource for your crops. Same with water.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, Andy, I think you have definitely imparted a huge amount of knowledge, and I'd say your voice is probably getting tired and people can get near information overload. So feels like it's a good time to wrap up, and it feels, I definitely know we'll be working together again, and it'd be great to have some other webinars, and we'll 100% share as an after that. I see someone, thank you very much, Christina, has dropped in the Erwin Wester, some of his YouTube stuff online, so I can share that with the group, and then I'll also put a link to Andy's book as well, just as a follow-up, and I'll share that with you, Andy. So just to kind of wrap up, Jesus, Andy, you've set the pace high now for the winter webinar series. That was some start, so thank you so much. It really was so well presented and communicated. And just to say, everybody, we're up next week on soil tests with Robbie Byrne, and it will start at 7:30, not 7. So we'll get that right next week. And then, as always, just to remind you that the annual conference is coming up on Tuesday the 25th. And these webinars are great, but you can't beat the old in-person connection as well. So I'll just keep reminding you about that. And yeah, so just to say, look at Andy, thanks a million, and just thanks to all of you. You've taken the time this evening to join, and just thanks to Jim Cronin, as always. Jim has been a master teacher and brought so many growers on board, so it's always a pleasure when you join and your input as well. So thank you, Jim. And yeah, guys, I hope it stops raining tomorrow. Okay, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, Andy, thank you so much. That was, 100%.